This evening. Jaden Buckles, Tracy Nichols, and myself will each touch upon a pretty significant element of the history of the Waupun Public Library, dating all the way back to 1858. So people think of the prison and they think of the school district or the city government as long-standing elements of Waupun's history. But the public library or the library, a library in some form or other, hasn't always technically been public, has existed for a really, really long time. So Jaden will begin by covering the early history. Tracy will discuss in detail the Carnegie Library, and then I will talk about a lot of different things. I'm bad at cleanup. So with that, I will hand it over to Jaden.
Thank you very much, Zach. So like he said, I'll be covering the early history of Waupun, so we'll get started here. Of course, today we're in the current Waupun Public Library. This was built in 1968, I believe. And a lot of people, of course, may not know when the library was started or how it was started. So that's what I'm going to be answering today. How did the Waupun Library begin? It all began with one man named Edwin Hilliard. You may have heard me talk about him before. We had the Waupun Cemetery Walk, where I portrayed him last year. And I've also posted things on my news page about him because he's such an important figure to Waupun. So I'll be talking about that here today. So to begin, obviously, he is an important figure in Waupun's history. He was an early Waupun industrialist. He was born in Atwater, Ohio in 1825. And he came to Waupun first with his brother in 1847. His brother was Joseph Talcott Hilliard, and they started they worked in lumber for 2 years before Edwin went to California for the gold rush. And in fact, back there we have one of the copies of his gold rush journal. Which is the account of when he was traveling to and from the California region. So there's a lot of things that he did, and I haven't listed them all because there's a lot that he was involved in. But basically, he was involved in starting several local associations, including several banks and insurance companies. The railway, he was involved in bringing that to Waupun. And he was also involved in starting the Forest Mountain Cemetery Association. And of course, the reason why I'm talking about him is because he was heavily involved in starting the Library Association. So in 1858, there were several citizens in Waupun who wanted to start a library association. About 80 signatures were collected on the original petition, and they petitioned the Justice of the Peace of Wisconsin at the time, John Ware, I believe, and he let them create their organization, and so they came together in February of 1858 to sign the Constitution. About 54 or 55 members signed the Constitution. This is a picture of all the signatures, and we actually have the original ledger in the display case over there. Which has the Constitution, the original lettering of it, and the signatures, and the meeting minutes from those times. So as part of the Constitution, of course, talked about the subscription. When they started, it was about $3 a year, and the first year was actually payable in books. So they of course needed the collection, so they said, well, you can get your subscription by donating books you don't want or need. Maybe other people can get some use out of them. And like I said, we do have the original meeting minutes, and of course, those are between 1858 and 1883. That ledger also includes all the catalog and the expenses from that time, which I find really interesting, but you might not. So in the early times of the library, Edwin Hilliard was the library. He was actually librarian for 37 years, the entire time that it was the Library Association. He was chosen as the librarian and the association clerk. When it began, it was the library only had actually 9 feet of shelves, which is to say only 3 shelves long that we have here. I actually measured them when I first read that. I'm like, that is not long at all. And so during this time, he was run out of his insurance office. He worked for the Dodge County Mutual Insurance Company. He actually started it with a couple other early industrialists in Waupun. And the subscription price, I mean, through these years, it shifted back and forth. There was most years where it was $2, and there was one year that was actually only $1. And right here, of course, is a annual report. This is like a little card. It's like a business card almost of the Dodge County Mutual Insurance Company. It was in 1861. I found this in one of the ledgers, and I was so happy to find it. It's such a cool thing. I love it. And of course, it also has his signature over here. I'd like that detail too. So, of course, the Library Association wasn't without its fair share of troubles. The Library Association actually almost faced dissolution in 1880 due to low interest in the community. And they weren't sure what to do because they didn't have the money to maintain it. So Hillier proposed that he become the sole proprietor of the collection and the association property, which included some furniture and lamps and whatnot as well. And the association agreed contingent on keeping the collection open to subscribers, and as long as he added to the collection with 100 volumes every year. Of course, he did keep that. And this right here is just a scan of one of the original pasted things at the beginning of the books that would show that they belong to the association. So when Hillier was getting older, he was wanting to make the library more accessible to people in Waupun. He couldn't keep doing it himself, as he had been doing it for quite some time, over 30 years. So he approached the city council, the Waupun City Council, with a proposal to make the library collection free for public use. And unfortunately, that didn't happen immediately, but it was something the city was interested in doing. They just didn't have the funds initially to do it. So in 1895, the city council agreed, creating the new library board, and they established the Hillier Library in honor of his work and giving his collection to the city. And right over here is actually the second ledger that we have, the first page of it, which says the records of the Waupun Public Library, and noting that it was the Hillier Library at the time. And it was, of course, November 1st, 1895 when it happened. So, I gotta breathe. So the library board was brought on when they made it a public organization. They immediately set to cataloging the collection, or re-cataloging, I should say, to more modern standards at the time. Of course, it has changed quite a bit since then. So, the library actually had moved several times throughout its history. And at this time, when it became the public library, they moved it into the Whitting, which eventually became the Davison Theater, which is actually on the block of Main and Carrington Street, which is currently Bent's Automotive. In 1901, the local women's clubs were actually interested in helping the library become a full free public library, and they raised funds to offset the cost to the city that they could make it a fully free library. And of course, during this time as well, the Carnegie Foundation was sent some letters from Waupun to see if they could get some parts of the grant to build a permanent library, which became the Carnegie Library, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. And this is just an example of the rules and regulations, little pamphlet we have. I love showing this off too. It's such a neat detail, but you're not gonna be able to read it, but it's a bit small, a bit blurry, but there is 23 rules here. And I just find that interesting detail there. Anyway, so in all, Edwin Hillier served 37 years as Waupun's sole librarian without pay. He served another 13 years on the Waupun Library Board from when it became the public library. And like I said earlier, the library moved 6 times before the Carnegie Library was constructed in 1905, so a total of 7 times now. Or 8 times actually, now that it's moved here. And then this here is just like an example of what the pasted inside would look like during that time period as the Hillier Library the Hilliard Public Library right there, and I actually have the book in the back with that showing. So unfortunately, in 1908, Hilliard was getting rather old, and he fell ill in September, and he resigned from his position on the Waupun Library Board. And so he ended up passing away later that year in December in 1908 at the age of 83. And he was buried in Forest Mountain Cemetery. And right there is his gravestone. So his legacy is almost underappreciated today, which is why I talk about him so much. For one, he was so involved with local industry that Waupun would be unrecognizable without his efforts. When it comes to historical documentation, he is the sole voice and a lot of he's the sole source for a lot of these things that we know about early Waupun. And if we didn't have what he had written, we wouldn't know anything at all. For example, when it comes to the Gold Rush Journal, that's just a very interesting experience that he wrote about. And more importantly, the historical sketches, which actually were run in the Waupun Leader News in 1902 and 1903, where he wrote about the early days of Waupun, what they were like for him and for other people, and the major things that happened throughout them. And of course, we got the association notes from the library, which I find personally very interesting. That's what you're here to learn about. And creation of the Waupun Public Library. If we didn't have him, we wouldn't have a library, or at least quite as early as we did. And I really like this quote. This was in the November 1st, 1905 Waupun Leader News. It goes, or this is from Lucius Dwight Hinckley. He was actually on the board of directors for the Waupun Public Library at the time. And he said, "It is but justice to say that from the outset, Mr. Hilliard was the moving spirit in the establishment and maintenance of the library. It is hardly too much to say that it is doubtful if all the other people in town contributed an equal amount of time, energy, and money. It is a question whether the town would now be in possession of the library, but for his efforts." And this had been the same month, the same week, actually, I think, that was the Carnegie opened. And that's pretty much it that I have to say. I'll turn it over to Tracy in a minute. I just want to point out that this map here is the map of Waupun from 1885, and several of the locations that he had the library were in downtown. I believe one was in 321 Main Street here. There was also one in the National Bank of Waupun, which was right next door, I believe. And then the wedding theater, of course, used to be right here. And it moved around a lot in the downtown area. So yeah, like I said, that's all I had to say. I don't know if you want to open up for questions now or later, or
How to do questions after each section here.
okay. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Did he have other family here?
Yes, he had a very big family, in fact. Oh, I forgot to mention this too. He has or he had a golden wedding in 1898, which was a very big affair. And we have about, I think, 30 of his golden wedding books. We had an example brought here as well, and could you bring that up for me quick? Thank you. And it has a variety of poems and information that they had talked about at the wedding, and it was and several pictures. Don't be careful with it. And it's just such a wonderful thing. And I look at stuff like this that's more than 100 years old, and none of the people would remember it. There's no one around left, and they live such fulfilling lives. It just, I don't know, I feel something. But yeah, there's also some pictures of his family. I'd have to go through it. Maybe you can look through it afterwards. But there are pictures of his family. I don't think any of his family still live in Waupun, unfortunately. But yeah, that's pretty much it there. Any other questions? Nancy,
You know, this isn't a library, but Hilliard, do you know what compelled them to move from Ohio to Waupun?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically. He does talk about the pioneering spirit in some of his writings. So I imagine they just felt like they could make a better life for themselves by doing more industry elsewhere. I don't know why they specifically chose Waupun, if they were just traveling and they just found Waupun, they're like, this is a great place to live, or if they chose it specifically because someone they knew. Unfortunately, we don't know that. I wish I did. That is a question I've actually had myself. You and I.
Why do you think they kept having to move the library? Like going to different storefronts that were not rented or something like that?
That's also a good question. I should have been more clear about this. They were actually in the upstairs offices for most of these places. The office for the library rooms were always in the office of Edwin Hilliard. Usually they were open in the evenings after work had been completed for the day. Why they moved specifically, I'm not sure. That's just how it would go. I do wonder about that too. It doesn't say anything specifically about that either. I wish I knew. Any other questions? Yep.
Did they have the publisher of that wedding book? Where would that have been?
Where would it have been printed?
Uh-huh.
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I don't think it says. Probably local, if I had to imagine.
Okay.
We did have some printing houses in.
Yeah.
Waupun.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Usually the newspapers actually.
Yeah.
We contacted the newspapers and they.
Yep. Yep. Any other questions? Mr. Mayor,
How did your fascination with Edwin Hilliard begin?
that's a great question. I would have to say, probably with this quote. I was, when I worked in the library, I worked here for several years when I was in high school, and I was an intern for a little bit as well. And I want to do some research on the Carnegie Library. So I went through the newspapers. We have the microfilm machine upstairs, and I found this quote here, and I read the entire article. It was such a wonderful article, and just this quote. When I first read it, I'm like, how do we not know this? How do we not know who this guy is? And the more I read about him, the more I was just baffled. Like, how do we not know who Edwin Hilliard is? Because he's done so much for the city that he should be hailed as one of the great heroes of Waupun, the same way that Seymour Wilcox is, and that Edwin or that Clarence Shaler is. At least that was how I felt, and that's how I continue to feel, and that's why I talk about him so much. Thank you for your question. Anyone else? All right, well, I'll turn it over to Tracy. I don't want to steal your thunder. I feel like I went a little bit long there. There you go.
This is working.
Oh, is it not? I might not have just been holding it closely. Has it been off the entire time? Could everyone hear me? Okay, good. That's good. I didn't even realize it was off.
Those of you who know me, I am not a very loud talker.
Turn it a little bit, see if that helps. You're there now. Talk a little bit more.
Hello?
Maybe a little too loud.
No, you're good.
Okay, so my public speaking is not gonna be nearly as wonderful as that fellow right there. He's got so much spirit for Edwin Hilliard. I'm gonna be talking a little bit about. See if I can push the right button. There we go, Andrew Carnegie. Does everybody know who Andrew Carnegie is? Most people think it's Andrew Carnegie, but it's not. It's Andrew Carnegie, like a horse. If you read his autobiography, he explains very well. He's a Scottish immigrant, and he wanted everybody to know that it's Carnegie. So you'll hear me sometimes say it that way and sometimes not. So he was born in Scotland, in Dunfermline, and we had that the computer to speak us how to pronounce that, because there's no way we would have gotten it. So born in Scotland, Carnegie immigrated to America at the age of 13. He worked odd jobs until 1850, when he was hired as a messenger boy for the telegraph office in Pittsburgh. There, he earned only $2.50 a week. He delivered telegrams, and when he did, he met many of the wealthy and influential people around Pittsburgh at the time. At 18, he transitioned from the telegraph messenger boy to riding freight trains to Altoona to pick up the monthly payroll for the Pennsylvania Railroad. On one trip in particular, he states he was riding carefree on the front of the engine with the payroll checks tucked into his coat when he realized he had lost them. Now, this would have been a really big problem for him, having to go back and say, sorry, everybody doesn't get paid because I lost the payroll. So he sheepishly went up to the engineer and he said, could you just back the train up just a little bit and we'll see if we can find it? And the engineer did, 3 miles. And they found it on the bank of a river. So his career could have been over at that moment, but it wasn't. So he was saved by that engineer. So that was a fun story. So while he was the boy delivering the telegrams, he met someone named Colonel James Anderson. Anderson would open his personal library, much like Hillier, and he had about 400 books. Each Saturday, he would open it to working boys who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to enjoy a book. Andrew vowed that if he ever became wealthy, he would provide this generosity to others. And in fact, by the end of his life, he donated nearly 90% of his fortune, $350 million at that time, to various causes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This library in Braddock was the first home to a Carnegie Library and a Carnegie Hall. It still functions as a library today. The monument you see is dedicated to Colonel James Anderson, the man who taught Andrew the importance of free library, and it's placed near the entrance. Okay, we can't say all the good things without mentioning this, because anytime you look at Andrew Carnegie, you're gonna find that some people didn't agree with him. They didn't agree with his politics. They didn't agree with how he made his money. And he was kind of harsh with his employees. So while building his fortune, occasionally his methods were scrutinized. He faced criticism in 1892, when workers at his Homestead steel mill decided to strike over low wages and better working conditions. I mention this because, while publicly in favor of unions in private, Carnegie and his CEO, Henry Clay Frick, had been plotting to break them. Carnegie Steel had made major innovations by installing the open hearth system in Homestead, which made it possible to make the steel suitable for structural beams and for armored plates for the United States Navy. And they paid much higher prices for this new metal. While Carnegie was enjoying record profits, he agreed with Frick's plan to lower the wages at the Homestead plant. Knowing the workers would organize at the end of their contracts in June, Frick began preparing in January by erecting a high fence topped with barbed wire. He constructed water cannons capable of spraying boiling water and then placed them near the entrances. He hired both the Pinkertons and the strike breakers. The Pinkertons were there to serve as guards to usher the strike breakers in. The striking workers fired the first shot at the Pinkertons. By the end of the night, 12 men lay dead, and many more from both sides were brutally beaten. They had men, women, and children out there fighting for their jobs. The Homestead Massacre, or the Homestead Strike, was a pivotal event in US labor history because it marked the first strike by an organized labor union. Although the strike would ultimately fail and set back workers' rights, it paved the way for the unions of today. You should note that Carnegie was not in the country at the time. He was in Scotland. So now I have a question. What does a library mean to you? Anybody? Don't be shy. What does it mean?
The freedom to become educated.
Okay, the freedom to become educated. Where would we be without a public library?
Community can come together.
Yes, it's great for community. Anything else? Okay. It's just the opposite of almost everybody else in the whole world. Okay, so now I'm gonna read you a quote from Andrew Carnegie about the strike. And then I want you to think about, was he wrong? Maybe he was wrong, maybe he wasn't wrong. So he reflected on his decision for lowering the wages. And he commented after the workers stated, increase our wages. They demanded, what good is a book to a man who works 12 hours a day, 6 days a week? And Carnegie thought about it, and he thought he knew better. And he said, if I had raised your wages, you would have spent the money buying a better cut of meat or more drink for your dinner. But what you needed, though you didn't know it, was libraries and concert halls. And that's what I'm giving him. So was he wrong? You think about how long it's been 130 years since the first Carnegie Library was built, how long that legacy has been perpetuated. It's an awfully long time to be serving the public. Okay. So here is the library he built in Homestead, just a few years after the strike. So he gave back to the citizens of Homestead. And in 1898, he gifted this public library and music hall. It's a beautiful castle, and it continues as home to the Homestead Public Library and Music Hall. It is the third of 4 in and around Pittsburgh that were fully endowed by the Carnegie Steel Company. Isn't that a gorgeous building, Ron? Okay. Okay. During the second half of the 19th century, the idea of a free library began to spread. Carnegie wanted his libraries housed in beautiful buildings with big windows and ample light. This was a change for many towns that housed makeshift libraries in churches, stables, the back of shops, or in homes. So these are a few of the correspondence letters. Carnegie had made a few requirements. The town was to put up 50% of the amount to build the building, or 10% of the building. And you had to make a stairway, and it had to be grand, and it had to have all of these things that he wanted for libraries and for people. So in 1901, when he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for almost $500 million, it became part of U.S. Steel, and Carnegie became the world's richest man. He then gave it away. The $350 million, which is $13 billion in today's money. Do you know you can buy for $13 billion? Okay, so the average cost of a home here in Waupun is about $209,000. How many? 65,000. 65,000 homes here in Waupun he could have bought. He could have built another 65,000 libraries. He initially built 2,500 libraries across the world. And he built about 1,767, I believe, here in the United States, half of which are still functioning as libraries today. So how many pickup trucks do you think you could buy with $17? 260,000 pickup trucks you can buy with $13 billion. Or 520 private jets. So. In 1897, Carnegie hired a man named James Bertram as his personal assistant. Bertram was responsible for fielding requests from municipalities for the funds and for overseeing and dispensing of grants for libraries. When Bertram received a letter requesting a library, he sent the applicant a questionnaire inquiring about the town's population, whether it had any libraries already, how large its books collection was, and what the circulation figures were. If initial requirements were met, Bertram asked the amount the town was willing to pledge for the library's annual maintenance, whether a site was being provided, and the amount of money already available. The architect was typically simple and formal, welcoming patrons to enter through a prominent doorway, nearly always accessed via a staircase from the ground level. An entry staircase symbolized a person's elevation by learning. Similarly, most libraries had a lamppost or a lantern installed near the entrance meant as a symbol of enlightenment. So, that being said, my husband and I love to be Carnegie tourists. So whenever we travel, we type on the internet and we say, where is there a Carnegie library that we can visit? So I've got a couple of them that we've visited already. Not all of them. This one was in Dubuque. I highly encourage you to go to every Carnegie library you can. They're just amazing. So these are from Minneapolis and St. Paul. There's 3 of them. This is the inside of this one here. And all 3 of them are still libraries. Bellevue, Ohio. This one, let me tell you, everything is arched and it's just gorgeous. There's a fireplace over on the side with a little bust of Carnegie. It's my mom sitting in the chair reading a newspaper. She's gonna hate me for putting that in here, but it's the truth. So we've actually visited this one a couple of times. Okay, this is Glover's. Oh, that one didn't really, oh, it's so sad. It's too dark. I apologize for that, but you can see the intricate stairways. And I just kind of wind around. We're really lucky to have one in our town. Has anybody been inside the building?
Where it was.
Has anybody been in one when it was a library? What's your favorite thing about it? The doors?
Squeaky
The squeaky floors.
Dark woodwork.
Oh, the dark woodwork, yeah, for sure. All right, so if you're interested, all you gotta do is type in the search bar, list of Carnegie libraries, choose your state, and it'll pop right up. It's color coded. It'll tell you which ones are still libraries, which ones are used for other functions, and which ones are no longer there. It'll give you directions. It'll give you operating hours. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
Was there a common theme to the ones that aren't there anymore, like not supported by cities or?
It would probably have been that they're not supported by the cities, or that they fell into disrepair, or business wanted to move in and it was the cheapest lot, or a new library was built. Anything else?
I think it's important, museum library, Waupun here, over the years, many years in school district, I think only at one time.
I believe that's going to be addressed with the next speaker.
In the city that they didn't go in and they didn't change, like, try to modernize it, so to speak. They didn't paint all of the nice woodwork. We traveled up to Bayfield and Washburn area, they have a couple libraries there, and they tried to, change it, make it, I think, modernized or something, more functional, whatever it might be, but they really did a disservice to the architecture.
Yeah, that's true. There have been a number of libraries that my husband and I have traveled to that have added on. And they've tried to keep some of it the same, and then you walk into the next section and there's elevators everywhere, and it's not the same thing. But some of them, like the ones in Minneapolis. This one here had all of the original woodwork. It had all the original tables, it had bench seating, and everything was exactly the way that it was when it was built. It's just so cool. Well, I'm going Norway. Look at you. Did everybody notice anybody right there? It is Zach, our next speaker. Come on down, Zach, if there's no other questions. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to Zach, thank you. You are.
Thank you, Tracy. Oh, I was, yes. Okay. There, that's better. Okay. So, my kind of leg of the lecture is talking about the existence of the library, more or less up to the construction and a little bit into the existence of the building that we're all sitting in and or standing in right now. So this is a photograph of the Carnegie Library. We just put them on exhibit in the museum. It kind of shows the construction in several phases. The title slide was basically the first photo, second photo, I think, taken. They took one in September, in October, and then this is probably December or January, once they actually kind of have it framed up. But as you can see, the windows and the doors aren't put in. A side note, it was just added to the State Register of Historic Places, but the Carnegie Library in Darlington, Wisconsin is a cookie cutter, like it's an exact match. They use red brick, we have stone, but it's virtually the exact same layout, the exact same style. And the one in Ripon actually has curved sides instead of the sharp edges. But that one too is a nice building to look at if we're shouting off examples of Carnegie's. Okay, so with this, I am talking about, as you all know, largely people think of museums and they think of just things, right? Just objects. What do we have this? Why do we have this? What is it? Basically, museums in today's world are in two businesses. They're in the storytelling business and they're in the solving mysteries business. There's a lot of detective work that actually goes on, especially with our objects, that a lot of them, the stories have kind of been separated from them over the years. So we've been digging through a lot of boxes and documents and having a lot of allergic reactions to mold. But we've been working at it pretty steadily. So Carnegie Library in Waupun cracks open its doors in October 21st of 1905. We just recently found the original guest book from the opening, the grand opening that day. There's several signatures, a very scribbly Edwin Hillier, and then a very young Clarence Shaler's signature, and it's just cool to see all of these people that would have showed up for such a public outing in 1905. Unfortunately, the basement was unfinished. They ran out of money. So it wasn't until 1911 when our friend Edgar Beach passed away. He was an early member of the board once it became a public library. He was an early member of the board, fairly affluent man in town, and he left the library about $700. I checked the exact number, I believe it was $740, which is roughly $22,000 in today's money. And with those dollars, the library was able to finish off the basement. And in the basement, they decided as you walk down the stairs that off to your right would be a large lecture room to do things like this, which it's actually probably too small to do things like this at this point, especially since Steve put up a partition. And the other one, the room across the way, would have a nice, lovely tiled floor and would serve the public as a museum. So you actually get a 2-for-1 deal tonight with this lecture. Congratulations. You also get the history of the Waupun Heritage Museum as well as the public library. So, a very brief little info spat. First rabbit hole of the night. What did museums look like at this time period in 1900, 1905, 1910? Lots and lots of things with no explanation. That was basically the gist of it. They had very few labels, if anything. The goal was a sense of wonder, right? A lot of people, like if you go to the Waupun Heritage Museum today, or Saturday, because that's the next time we're open, you will see things, you will see stories from Waupun's history, things that you have some connection to or some familiarity with. In this time, people wanted to see the rare, the bizarre, the exotic, right? From faraway places, and oh, where did this, oh, this is so fascinating, right? You didn't know, nobody knew, and that was the fun of it, right? There was no clue. So this is an example, this is a probably late 18th century style of museum where, yeah, crocodiles on the ceilings, it's just gonna be a big party. That's what they look like. That's a pretty accurate depiction of a museum. And you know what? Up until very recently, Waupun's museum kind of looked like that. Random things everywhere. And you just had to hope that Jim Laird remembered what it was at that point in time. So this is the context of museums in this time period. So collectively, this era in museums was known as the era of the cabinets of curiosities. They were just little cabinets with all these little trinkets, and you were just supposed to ooh and ah, and that was it. So in 1911, Waupun is offered this teaching collection. The Waupun High School, which was conveniently pretty much about where you're sitting right now. This is the Southward High School, which became the first Union High School in 1900. They were offered this collection of rocks and seashells and coral. Museums at the time were partly for fascination, but mostly for research. They held on to specimens and examples of rocks and different things from all over the world for researchers and scientists, so they didn't have to hold them in their own studies. They could have a collective place where you could go and look at those things and examine them. So from, I don't exactly know what the source was, but the superintendent for the school district was on the library board at the time and said, basically, our school is getting extremely overcrowded. It was a very small building relative to the population size. We got a new school building, which many of you probably remember as the middle school, 2 years later in 1913. But it's like, basically, we don't have room. Sorry, thousands of rocks and shells, we don't have any place to put them. But we do know of this newly built public library that has not very many books at this point. Why don't you set up a little museum in the library? Oh, great idea. They'll never run out of room. So with that, we have 3 principal collections that comprised this early junk that we have. The first one was the teaching collection of rocks. We love rocks. And then donor by the name of Sanborn, and I think we can track down who the actual person was, but we're just gonna say the Sanborn family. Sanborn family, the Wilcox family, and then Miss Kelly, Miss A.B. Kelly, which Kyle and I are very familiar with. We see her name all the time. They donated big collections of things. And the collections in museums can be categorized into ethnology, anthropology, geology, archaeology, history. So Sanborn was history. Thankfully, Sanborn had a lot of local history, which is kind of interesting because a lot of museums, especially our size in this community, in our area, we started collecting way earlier than a lot of other people did. So the Dodge County Historical Society didn't start collecting until 1940. Fond du Lac County Historical Society didn't start collecting until 1946. Our collection dates back to 1911. So some of the stories that we are able to tell go way further back than they are able to, which is kind of cool. Miss A.B. Kelly frequently traveled to China until sometime when the communists took over, so she kind of stopped doing that. But she apparently had an adopted child in China, or she brought them over, but she made frequent visits and she would bring back early cultural things from China that we actually have on display in this building on the second floor. So those are some cool trinkets to take a look at. But again, keeping in mind that a lot of people wanted to see things from elsewhere. Travel was not very easy. In Waupun in 1911, you'd be lucky if you made it to Chicago during your lifetime. It was very rare to travel that far, let alone out of the country. So her bringing those things back was really fascinating for people at the time. Now they're just kind of, you know, they're there. So then Wilcox was a lot of Native American objects, a lot of earlier anthropological collections, different arrowheads, different points that they have, axe heads, some objects that they would have used for ceremonies. So we now have one case of those things, and we actually hope to flesh out that exhibit in the near future with a little bit more context as to the Ho-Chunk and the Ojibwe tribes that would have inhabited this area. But thanks to Wilcox, we have a pretty good early collection. And then of course we've gotten many, many things, and it just doesn't stop. Even to this day, we just keep getting things. So this is the blueprints. It's also in this case over here. This is the blueprint from 1911, showing the three tables that would have been glass, basically exactly like that one in the middle, with all of our little objects and trinkets and rocks and different things. Plants and birds and rocks and things. Isn't that the lyrics of the song? Okay. So briefly, I'll stick on here for just a second, and I will point out very quickly some of the things that we have in these cases here. Very early stories. So like I said, I solve mysteries for a living, basically. Well, I don't even do it for a living because I don't get paid. But you know, first we have to figure out what is it. Once we figure out what it is, if we can figure out what it is, then the next question is, why is it here? So beginning with these flags and this ship bolt, I've been very thankful, and I think the entire community of Waupun has deeply benefited from a partnership between Waupun and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. They have some really active volunteers who have actually paid us a few visits and helped us identify some of our military collection, especially our early military collection. So these two flags here, this is a British ensign, and then this one is actually a flag from the Kingdom of Sardinia, but apparently it was called a Mexican flag at the time, and I'm like, okay, well, broken clock is right twice a day, I guess. But anyway, these two flags were actually taken by the USS Itasca, which was a ship in the Gulf of Mexico during the American Civil War. There would be things called blockade runners for the Confederacy. And basically they'd float around in the Gulf of Mexico and they would try to get supplies up through the various channels, through the rivers, up into Confederate territory to resupply their troops, the Confederate troops. So Union ships would sail the coast and keep these blockade runners from sneaking up the river. And these are two flags, and they would of course use false flags. So this was a British ensign, but it didn't come off a British ship, and this was from the Kingdom of Sardinia, and it didn't come off a ship from Sardinia. So these were two flags that were captured, and then this ship bolt, yes, Edmund Jones, not Edward Jones as the original catalog. I'm like, that's a financial advisor. So this bolt actually has an interesting story, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can come over here and read it, or I can read it later because it's in really tiny print. these three objects were donated by a woman whose brother was Edmund Jones, who lived in Milwaukee, and he passed away. He was a Civil War veteran from the USS Itasca. He passed away in Milwaukee. She was in charge of dealing with all of his junk, and she just brought it here to this museum because she lived in Waupun. She's like, here, take this. So we have it. Not really a Waupun connection, kind of a cool story. So that's that. And then over here, this is very recent research. Former volunteers with the Waupun Historical Society thought this was a German World War I helmet, which at first glance, it certainly looks like that, until you look at the American eagle that says E pluribus unum on it. Doubt that was a German phrase, especially in World War I. It's actually a helmet that was worn by Charles Lindsley, who was a Civil War veteran and then served for a period in the National Guard. This is a National Guard dress helmet from 1881. Along with his cap that he would have worn for regular service. And Mr. Lindsley was also a former mayor of Waupun. So a pretty significant little story there. And then down here are some examples of our rocks. Gotta love our rocks. And here, lastly, these are examples. These are like the biggest, like, what the heck are these examples? These are early examples of cuneiform writing. There was an expedition to ancient Babylonia, not back in time, but to the place that was ancient Babylonia. And they found this really big collection of ancient cuneiform writing from thousands and thousands of years ago. It made its way to the University of Chicago, and somehow 3 of them came here. So yay, we have ancient cuneiform writing. Awesome. But again, the story that it has is it's from far away and it's from long ago. Plop it in the museum, why not? So I will briefly touch upon some of the women who ran the show. Had to give a shout out to some of our early librarians in town. Catherine Bunker Walker, Mildred Young, Margaret Minton Brickerhoff, and Clara Lindsley. Yes, the daughter of Charles Lindsley. So you're wondering why we got his helmet? She dropped it off here. Thank you, Clara. Okay, so just wanted to give a little credit to those ladies. But I will touch upon one of my favorite stories that Waupun has to offer that we found out relatively recently. Again, solving our mysteries, we find new stories every day that are sources of inspiration and just a really good story to tell. If you've been on the cemetery walk, who's been on the cemetery walk? Anybody? Okay, so about half of you. So this last time we had Jeannie Lujak portray Joanna Maria or Ree de Hartog van Leeuwen, who was, that's her right here. She immigrated to the United States with her friend. I'm trying to remember her name. Why am I blanking on her name now? I was just reading this like 15 minutes ago. Maddie, yes, her friend Maddie Bernstein. The two became friends under very, very, very strange and very unfortunate circumstances. You see, Ree de Hartog or Ree van Leeuwen at the time was a resistance fighter for the Dutch resistance in World War II against the Nazis in the Netherlands. Maddie Bernstein and her son Rolf and her husband Henry were captured by the Nazis in the Netherlands. They were in hiding, and Maddie was sent to Theresienstadt ghetto with her husband and her son, and then eventually her husband and her son were selected and were exterminated at Auschwitz. Maddie managed to survive the rest of the Holocaust, and after Theresienstadt was liberated, she went back to the Netherlands, to the last location that she knew people, and Ree was still there. So the two of them, along with her sister, Maddie's sister, she also survived. They kind of cobbled together. I think about half of their families still survived the Holocaust, nephews, nieces, sisters here and there. They all immigrated to the United States in 1947. Ree married John de Hartog, who had relatives here. The de Hartog family is probably familiar to some folks still. And they lived together. Maddie lived with Ree and John on Fond du Lac Street. And Reed Hartog was a librarian at the Carnegie Library from the 1940s until the 1970s. And interestingly, as a claim to her, and I have no reason to doubt it, one of the families, she would deliver supplies to several families, and one of the families was the Anne Frank family in Amsterdam. So that's a pretty, I think, significant connection, global connection to an event that is still resonates to this day, clearly, but it has a Waupun connection. So that's a story. Thankfully, we were able to kind of uncover and weed out within the last few months, and I think it's a pretty cool connection. So lastly, I'll wrap up with the WPA, the New Deal. That actually had a very significant impact on public libraries and public buildings in general. So the Works Progress Administration during the Roosevelt administration, it was a federal program to basically get Americans working. It was let's create deficit spending, which will never set any sort of bad precedent at all. We will temporarily go into deficit spending, get people the money that they need, relief, recovery, reform, that sort of thing, blah, 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 blah. That was the mindset. So with this, there were several projects that benefited Waupun's public libraries specifically. First, they employed artists to paint, to create things, to decorate these large numbers of public buildings, entire high schools. There's a great example, I think it's Appleton. I don't know if it's northwest, south, or east, but one of the Appleton high schools is still a really, really ornate example of New Deal architecture, because you had all these really, really talented people who were jobless, so they really took their time so that they could get paid more. But we have these two paintings over here are by Emily Groom. She was one New Deal artist. They are hanging very prominently in the building. And Waupun received a total of 12 New Deal pieces of art, and these are very sought after and very, not, I would say, valuable monetarily, very, very valuable culturally in the United States. We received a total of 12, and until last year, I was only able to account for 6 of them, and those 6 were the ones that were in the museum. So we also have some prints by Tom Rost and Gerard Baker, which are very nice pieces to look at, until such time as I was describing to Pam one of the missing paintings, which is like a baseball field, a baseball game, and it's framed, it should say WPA or Public Works Art, something like that. And she's like, I have a baseball painting hanging in my office. And I'm like, I just have to go see this painting. And sure enough, we were able to locate a 7th WPA painting that must have just been taken by the library when they moved, and I don't know why they didn't take Emily Groom's, but took this Garrett Sinclair painting. Either way, these artists are all very well documented at the Wisconsin Museum of Art. So they're very prominent pieces, and we're extremely lucky to have them. And Pam was very happy to take down her very tacky inspirational quote painting and put up this lovely Garrett Sinclair painting. So it's up there as well with our other old artifacts. It's hanging right behind her desk. It's a very nice piece to look at. And they also did bookbinding for the WPA. We have a few books, like I think 2 at least, that say Rebound by WPA Books Project. And it's like, okay, great. It's not a particularly interesting book, which is unfortunate, but and then identifying and cataloging Waupun's early museum objects. So the labels that you'll see in this case and the labels that you'll see upstairs are original WPA labels that were printed by the Milwaukee Public Museum. So Ira Edwards, who was the director for the Milwaukee Public Museum at the time, one of the Works Progress Administration sub-projects, I guess, for Wisconsin was the museum project. So going to all of these local communities, identifying what they have, getting them cataloged, and thankfully we still have that, and we were able to relocate the original catalog so we could start re-identifying some of these objects that were identified so nicely by the Milwaukee Public Museum all those years ago. So then, I think that's all that I have on slide form, but I will tell you this very juicy tale of the time that the Carnegie Library was almost demolished. Yes, it's true. You wouldn't think that Waupun has any sort of bad record with keeping up its historic buildings, but in this specific instance, there was so 1955, museum was overcrowding, way too much stuff to do, very, very, very little space. The entire museum that was in the basement was boxed up and put in the attic until, of course, 1956. The Historical Society was started, and it's like, you know what? This is your problem now. And we took all of the objects, and then eventually we got the building. But obviously, the need for a new library was cooking. People started thinking, you know, we need something new, something bigger. And there was a gentleman who owned this property. South Ward was demolished in 1958. He owned the property, and he wanted a pretty penny for it. And the city said, okay, well, we'll offer you this. It's a pretty good sum of money. You know, I don't exactly know what the number was, but he wanted more. He wanted more from the city, and he was refusing to sell it. So the city said, you know what, we're going to call his bluff. We are going to vote to demolish the Carnegie and just build it on that existing site. We don't need your site, sir. And unfortunately, a lot of people got really upset that they were going to tear the Carnegie down. And they went to the common council meeting and they complained, which of course, as Mayor Bishop knows, is sometimes very effective. And the council rescinded the ordinance. They decided not to do that, but thankfully, not before the guy came to them and said, fine, I'll sell you this land for the price that you asked for initially. So ended up working out very effectively. We kept our Carnegie and we got this new building on this current site. As for the Carnegie, once they moved out, it was the Education Service Center for a very brief period of time, 1969 to 70, 68 to 70 or something like that, 71-ish. Very short time. And then, this is a fun one that Jim Laird has actually recounted to me himself a few times. And I don't think he remembers that he recounts it to me. But anyway, he told me that there was this big to-do about what he fought really hard to get the Carnegie to be the museum. That was his big thing. And of course, it came down to two groups of people. The senior center wanted it, because at the time, the senior center didn't have a home, or it was a very inadequate place that they were meeting. And the museum group wanted it. And the common council ended up saying, you know what, we're gonna give it to the senior center. I think the seniors need it more than the museum does. Oh, shoot. Fine, let the seniors have it. Okay. 2 months later, seniors come back to the meeting. We can't do the stairs. And so the rest is history. The Heritage Museum was opened in 1971, October of 71. So we just recently celebrated our 50th anniversary as a museum there. So within a number of years, I think we still have over a decade yet, but it's fast approaching a longer life as a museum than it ever was a library. So I think for the initial $10,000–$15,000 it ever cost to build it, we've gotten some good use out of it. So stop by if you haven't been recently. You'll probably see something different, which is a really, really wild awakening for people. Oh, this wasn't here the last time. No, it wasn't. We actually swapped stuff out. It's a different story. Alrighty, so are there any questions from me on this element of the history? This building, of course, was constructed in 1968. It saw additions in the 90s and in 2008. And it's supposedly haunted. That's kind of cool. That could be a whole separate lecture. The ghosts of Waupun.
I tell my own story for that too.
Yeah, there's some good stories there. But yeah, any questions? We also have the director of the library here to answer any questions that I can't, or I could make something up.
Of the 12 WPA pieces, you know of 7.
Mhm.
Do you have any idea what happened to the other 5? And do you know of any of these pieces are, if they're in private collections?
It's a very good question. This was one of my little research rabbit holes while I should have been studying. We do have a full list of the works and the artists from the newspaper in 1935 when they all came here. I think 1 or 2 of them went to City Hall. There was at least one that was placed at the high school. I think one was at the post office. They were kind of scattered around. And they're all still technically on loan. They're all still owned by the federal government. Federal government doesn't know where any of them are, but they're all still owned by the federal government, which is really just a testament to the federal government. Thank you, feds. So we have a record of what ones they are. I was able to find one that recently sold on eBay, and it has the exact same frame and everything, and it was sold in Wisconsin. So I would imagine that, and just knowing how the high school works and having had to fight to get things from the high school to the museum, it was really like, hey, do you want this painting? Yeah, sure, I'll take it. And off it went, never be seen again or tracked again or whatever. So, and that's not just the high school. I'm sure it probably happened at other points in time as things get moved around. There was no tracking for these. And at the time, they weren't considered objects. They weren't considered a part of a collection. So there was no like need. It was just a painting on a wall. People didn't really see the significance of it yet. But yeah, I think there was just an exhibit on Emily Groom at the Cedarburg Art Museum, which I didn't even know Cedarburg had an art museum, but they do. And there was just an exhibit on her. So some pretty cool pieces, definitely. But yeah, so we know which ones, but we don't know, all we can do is kind of look around and see. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What was the name of the man that sold the property here or the library?
I would have to double check. I only read that account once. There was like a series of newspaper clippings that were clipped. And it was like in an envelope or something, and I was just paging through them. So I tried to find them in the Leader News, but it's like that the property was sold in the early 60s and they didn't vote to build the new one until the mid 60s, and then the building didn't actually start until the late 60s. So it's like this whole like random lineage. But I could pretty easily find that record of who owned this property at that time and sold it. But that's at least the account that I was kind of told, both from Jim Laird and then from the clippings that we have, was, kind of piecing that together.
Zach, examples of how we acquire stuff. You want to share the story of the Civil War sword?
Oh, sure, yeah. So we're still collecting. We don't stop. Kyle's really upset about that, but no, we never stop. We try to be a little bit more picky about what we take in. But so many people just like, here, take it. And then before we can ask them to fill out a form, they're already like, shifting in gear and driving it. But no, we did just, it's exactly that. We don't want your hats. Okay. But we did just receive, there's a story about a gentleman who had this sword, and he was a very little kid, and he had this Civil War sword, it had the sheath and everything, and he would go out. His family would go camping in the 1950s, and he would play pirate and everything, hacking through woods and stuff and playing with his siblings and his friends. And eventually he sold it to his brother for a bicycle, which I think was a good deal. And then later on, several decades later, his brother passes away, and he's living in Pennsylvania now, this guy. And he inherits his brother's things, and among these things is this sword that he had traded to his brother so long ago, but it's this sword. And upon receiving this sword, he realizes that there's a name etched into the sheath, and it says H.C. Curtis, 10th Wisconsin Company, what have you, I don't know. But so that's what we have. That's what he had, and he did some research, and thankfully all these years ago, this starry-eyed man, Jim Laird, as we all know, decided to put our collection into a computer database instead of just written in the record. And then several years after that, he had this really wild idea. So we're probably one of the first museums of our size to get our collection into a computer. That's a big deal. in museum world. And then we were also probably one of the first to get it online, where you could just go online and search something and find a document and then request us for a copy and we'll send you one. It's currently not online because we're doing a lot of cleaning up. There's a lot of spelling errors. But eventually that's the goal, is to get it back online. And he was able to track down this Henry Clay Curtis from Waupun, who owned this sword. This was his Civil War dress sword. And he contacted the high school first, who said, thankfully I was substitute teaching that day because the principal just called me immediately and she's like, Zach, I think we have a problem for you. And I said, oh, great, a problem. But no, this man eventually was doing a tour back to his home state of Wisconsin with his family, and he donated this dress sword. So we now have a Civil War sword from former principal of Northward High School and former superintendent of Dodge County Public Schools, Henry Clay Curtis, who was another gentleman who was portrayed in our cemetery walk this last fall. So yeah, kind of a cool story. We get those every once in a while. That's what keeps me going, is the cool stuff. Not all the other stuff. That's Kyle's. I get the cool stuff. Anything else? Yeah.
Your second line says constructing public buildings, roads and other services.
Mhm.
Isn't the bridge at the Rock Golf Club, was that built by
Yes.
WPA?
This is actually, I don't want to tell too much because this is actually one of my exhibit ideas, is Waupun in the Great Depression, or New Deal in Waupun, the retaining wall. And I think the bridge, they redid the bridge in the 30s. But actually you could probably see it right now before all the greenery comes in. But if in the very late fall and the very early spring, you can see across on the banks on the retaining wall, it says WPA 1934 in that thing. So I think they've tried to clear that out every once in a while, but it's a never-ending battle. The swimming pool that used to be out in, not the one that's there now, that was way more recent. But the old one, which a lot of you probably remember, was a WPA. The band shell that used to be out in County Park and the bar, I think, that used to be out there were also WPA. So quality of life stuff was really the WPA's big deal. Oh, the gymnasium and the science and home economics labs on the 1913 high school were also WPA. Actually, it was PWA because there's a difference.
Yeah.
FDR's alphabet soup. Okay. Yes, there's a lot of big contributions from the WPA to Waupun. Believe it or not, as slow as they are and as inefficient as they are, the federal government can do some good things every once in a while. Anything else? Any other questions? Kyle?
It's an interesting story how we acquired a Shaler sculpture.
Ooh, oh gosh, you're just Zach's greatest hits.
Yes.
I imitate Jim for this one. He always tells us he's good, great storyteller. Yes, so Diogenes, which is our 11th sculpture, mystery sculpture. He's perched in one of our fireplaces in the Carnegie. 5 fireplaces in that building. That was how it was heated for the first 10 years, and then they put a boiler in, which scares me now when it clanks and I'm working there. Anyway, so he's perched on a fireplace. It's in the new Shaler exhibit, which just opened. And he's a little Greek mystic. He's 22 inches tall, which all of the Shaler sculptures, even Dawn of Day, were first cast as little 22-inch sculptures, and then eventually they became bigger. Diogenes was in Shaler's Pasadena studio in his home in 1941. Shaler passed away. That's a whole other story of how he passed away. He fell off a balcony. Anyway, the Diogenes, this sculpture, was missing when the family went to collect all of his belongings. They didn't know where Diogenes went. Most people believe that he just gifted it to someone. Maybe, we don't know who, but he gave all of his sculptures away. He never sold any of his works. But anyway, Diogenes was missing. Nobody knew where it went. Probably about around 2002, 2003, Jim Laird gets a phone call at the Heritage Museum, which, believe it or not, still has a phone. And this man says, well, I'm in Pasadena, the Pasadena area. I just picked up this little sculpture at a garage sale. And it says C.A. Shaler on the bottom, and I don't know if he like looked it up in a phone book, or maybe he had the internet at that, yeah, probably had the internet at that point, and sees that C.A. Shaler Company pops up Waupun, contacts the Historical Society here in town, and of course, Jim Laird tells him all about it, way more than I'm telling you. And eventually the guy's like, well, this sounds pretty important. I think I'll just give it to you. So we ended up getting this mystery missing Shaler sculpture. He didn't have his lantern at the time. And Kyle, remind me of the gentleman who restored all of Waupun sculptures. Tony Razor, that's right. He actually volunteered to make a replica little lantern that Diogenes holds. So the lantern is a replica, but the rest of the statue is original, and he's still in the fireplace, just like it was in Shaler's home in Pasadena. So that's one that we always like to point out, because it's only the people who come in, which is like 4 people a day. But anyway, it's actually gotten a lot better recently. The weather's warmer. But they all get to see it because it's one that's not publicly outside that you can see anytime, or can kind of forget that they're there sometimes because they're so much a part of the geography of the community. So that's a cool piece to have, little Diogenes. I tried looking for more. There's a marble sculpture of a Shaler piece in the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. The only marble piece that was ever done by Shaler. So see that sometime. I don't know where it's near. It might be near Walt Disney or Michael Jackson or whoever else is buried in Forest Lawn. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
What hours are you exactly open?
Ooh, best question. We are open Wednesdays 3:30 to 7, with the exception of when we're here doing a presentation. And then we are also open Saturdays 10 to 2. So that's what we try to be open during those times. Steve and I are, sometimes we can't make it, but Kyle is a substitute for us, so he's often tapped in. Any other questions there? Yeah.
In 1970, when I came and applied for a job, I had to apply at the Carnegie Library.
Oh, that was the ESC at the time?
Yes, 1970. Now, you said that 1971. I just want to know about the time frame. Where did the education center go? I didn't think it was built. I mean, they had to go someplace.
Yeah, right. I think I want to say that 1970 was, and you probably remember this better than me, because I, wasn't living. I believe, if I'm remembering my timelines correctly, that there was a big addition put on to the high school in that time frame.
That's what took place during my whole interview. He was showing me the pictures. This was Kuya.
Yeah, Kuya, right. So I think that the Education Service Center moved into those offices briefly at the 63 building. And then the ESC was constructed, I think in 73 it was finished. So it was only there for a brief time. But yes, that was kind of the Carnegie Library is a very brief stint as a senior center and a very brief time as the Education Service Center. But of course, if you have any other questions, you can just talk to me personally. I'm a wealth of knowledge and some BS, but I can help you with any questions that you may have. I do just want to give a quick plug, a thank you to Tracy Nichols and to Jaden Buckles for doing the research or just knowing the stuff for this presentation. Also want to give a thanks to Kyle Clark. He's been helping quite a bit with cataloging and research. We have probably the most cataloged and identified that this museum has ever had in its history since 1911. And it's pretty much all thanks to him. So that's a huge step in the right direction for our museum. And if you are all ever interested or willing, or just have some time to burn, contact us if you want to volunteer or become a member. We do have little membership things you can fill out back there. There is stuff for all interests and all age levels and all capabilities. It's, you know, there's something for people to do. There's always a story to be found and discovered and learned. So we're learning things every day. Even though the history pretty much stays the same, we're just learning more of it. So certainly take a look at the things in the cases here. There's cases upstairs with more stuff. There's just always more stuff. All things are from the original collection, the original Waupun collection between 1911 and 1920. So certainly take a look at those things. There's some of them have cool stories. You know, maybe it's worth it. So yeah, any other questions, just let me know. Thank you all very much for showing up tonight. And thank you to Pam and Brett for the library. Happy National Library Week. That was the whole impetus for doing this in the first place. So it's a pretty fun time. There are also the original blueprints laid out on the table for the Carnegie Library that we found in the attic randomly one day. Which I think they're really cool treasures. So,
And the architect is still in business.
yes, Fuller is the architect, still in business. There are actually some houses in town, offhand, I don't know which ones they are, but Steve, I think, has that information.
I think there's one in Carrington.
Yeah, there's a few Fuller houses. The architect that designed and constructed the Carnegie Library is still going, and they were actually able to send us their copies of the Carnegie blueprints as well. So we have a digital file. We don't need to find a really, really big scanner to scan them in. We just have them already. So cool stuff. Thank you all very much.
It's all stuff. Steve said this end of the trail and the farmer's elevator with that's a really interesting part. Right. Thank you.